Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Roger Stone Show. Corrupt former FBI director and special counsel Robert Mueller, who tried to destroy both me and my family, as well as Donald Trump and dozens of others, has gone on to his maker. He was, in my view, a huge participant in the greatest single abuse of power and dirty trick in American political history, and we'll talk about that later. But right now, we'll talk about a huge concern that I have. I believe that Donald Trump was first elected in 2016 because of a free, fair, and open field in terms of the internet and mass-based modern communications. I believe one of the reasons they were able to steal the election, in my opinion, from him in 2020 is because of a campaign of online censorship, cancellation, manipulation of algorithms, shadow banning, other manipulations of online activity, extraordinary political dirty tricks in order to tip the scales for the Democrats. Among the worst offenders, however, one that doesn't get as much notice as they should is Google. And Dr. Robert Epstein, who I must acknowledge is literally one of the smartest human beings I have ever met. I'm fascinated by every one of his interviews, is a senior research psychologist at the American Institute for Behavioral Research and Technology. He has a PhD from Harvard. He's a former editor of Psychology Today, but he's also, more interestingly to me, a pioneer in the study of online manipulations. Dr. Epstein is by no means a Republican, a conservative, a Trump supporter. He's essentially a scientist in this case. In December 2023, Dr. Epstein testified for the second time before Congress after reporting on his success in creating the world's first large online system for preserving and analyzing the ephemeral content of big tech companies and how they were using them to influence elections, children, adult human behavior, and so on. He's built an amazing dashboard. You can go yourself to AmericanDigitalShield.com. I am proud to have Dr. Robert Epstein join me on the Roger Stone Show.
Hi there, Roger.
So, Dr. Epstein, you have opened my eyes. I see the executives from Google going to the Trump White House, kissing the great man's derriere, pretending in some way that they didn't try to tilt two elections against him and later destroy him. Sundar Pichai at the Trump White House to discuss government partnerships, workforce investment, and political concerns about Google. The Alphabet executives show up at the meetings during the Trump transition. They certainly pay for all of the high-priced tickets at Trump's inauguration. They show up at a White House dinner, both Sergey Brin and Sundar Pichai, who, although Google is a public company, is essentially controlled by the two largest shareholders. But as you correctly pointed out in a brilliant interview with Michael Knowles, we've seen almost an 87% increase in liberal bias that Google is putting before into email screens. Explain to me what's going on here.
Sure. Well, as I think everyone knows, it's not a secret that President Trump is somewhat vulnerable to flattery. And sure enough, they started a few weeks before the 2024 election, they started throwing flattery and money at him. And they got him and they got the DOJ to back off. They had been trying to put some constraints on Google, and they literally just backed off, and now President Trump seems to think that Google is his best buddy. You just mentioned a number. Let me update this for you, and you'll really see how diabolical this plan is on the part of Google and to a lesser extent some other tech companies. They backed off in 2024 because of the monitoring that my organization was doing nationwide and is still doing 24 hours a day. And there was also a big case, an antitrust case against Google, which ruled in 2024 that Google is a monopoly. So they backed off on their election manipulation. We have all the data showing that. Our system forced a 20% drop in political bias on Google itself, and a 50% drop at that time in 2024 on political bias on YouTube. So they really did back off in 2024, and in effect, we had a fairer election in 2024 than we've had in the past, and that allowed President Trump to win the election. But then they came up with this crazy plan of cozying up to the president, and they got the DOJ to back off, so there was no breakup of Google, and they got President Trump to be their best buddy. And since that time, now I'm going to give you the new numbers here. Since that time, since the presidential election in 2024, there has been a more than 275% increase in political bias on Google itself, and more than a 450% increase in political bias on YouTube recommendations. Now those are humongous numbers. In other words, they are playing quite a game here. You could call it a false flag operation, I suppose, because basically now that they've gotten Trump and the DOJ to back off, even though we're still collecting the data, we're still seeing what they're doing, they are just going all out right now, all out to make sure, yeah?
So, Dr. Epstein, give my listeners an idea of specific instances in which they manipulate the data that we see to benefit the left, the Democrats, and an anti-Trump agenda. Give us examples.
I can give you a great example. On October 31st, 2024, our system detected that on Google's homepage, they were sending out 50% more Go Vote reminders to Democrats than to Republicans. Now, their homepage is seen 500 million times a day in the United States. So that is a very, very blatant manipulation of votes, because you end up with millions of more people showing up to vote, and most of those are Democrats. So we went public with that on October 31st, and on November 1st, just a couple days before the election, they stopped. We got them to stop. So from that point on, the 1st until the 5th of November, they did not send out more Go Vote reminders to members of one party. That's a blatant example. Right now, they are sending out more register to vote reminders to Democrats. Very soon, they're going to be sending out more mailing your ballot reminders to Democrats. And then, of course, they're going to do it again as we get closer to the election. They are going to send out more Go Vote reminders to Democrats. Those are just...
That's interesting. I actually think that's an illegal campaign, illegal corporate campaign contribution. In fact, in violation of federal election law. Doesn't mean that they, of course, will be prosecuted for it. I think that many people who want a free, unfiltered dialogue on the internet feel just because Elon cracked the monopoly and established an extraordinary beachhead for free speech and free expression, that issue has disappeared. Meanwhile, the manipulation, particularly by Google, but also on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube, continues to this day, and it will have a deleterious effect in the 2026 election. I think they realized after the election of Trump that they had to try to get the toothpaste back in the tube. They put in all this manipulation, central manipulation, to create this wall of censorship and cancellation, manipulating the algorithms. So if you defended Trump, you would be limited who saw your defense, for example. And the way you have charted this in a completely scientific, not a predetermined desire, but again, I urge people to go to America's, that's with an S, digitalshield.com. You also just posted an extraordinary piece called The Case Against Gmail. This is, you say, we trust our email providers to be neutral carriers of our private thoughts, but Google has traded that trust for a surveillance model that scans, stores, analyzes, and manipulates that data. In an era of invisible algorithms, how do we build a digital world where free doesn't mean surrender? It's a brilliant, brilliant piece. We've got about 2 minutes before the break, but why don't you begin to take us down this trail?
Sure. This is a piece I've been wanting to write for years and years, because most people in the whole world use Gmail, and they don't even realize what's going on. Gmail is nothing like the U.S. Postal Service. They have no obligation to deliver your mail. They very frequently, when they've done this to the Republicans, they divert the emails into people's spam boxes so they never see them. So Gmail is a tool of manipulation and surveillance. It is nothing like the U.S. Postal Service or any national postal service. It is a scam.
What do we got on? I absolutely agree. And we're going to have about 20 swing districts. The ability to geo-target their mischief is particularly troublesome to me. And the president has to recognize that despite the fact that all these tech executives who jointly, whether it's Tim Cook or any Mark Zuckerberg or any of the titans of the Silicon Valley who may be now showing up for dinners and conferences, these people tried previously to kill him in an unprecedented effort at censorship, cancellation, and manipulation of what people can see. Google is torquing up to do it again, and it will be meaningful in the midterm elections, in which I suspect it boils down to about 20 swing districts, and they can geo-target, as I say. I expect the Republicans to be more than competitive. The war certainly was unforeseen, but I'm convinced that the Republicans still can win the House and hold the Senate. I call those who are panicking at this point panicans. I'll be right back with Dr. Robert Epstein, one of the most brilliant people I know, who has done a deep dive on how Google is manipulating our attitudes about virtually everything.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
We're talking to Dr. Robert Epstein. He is the senior research psychologist at the American Institute for Behavioral Research and Technology, former editor-in-chief of Psychology Today, has a PhD from Harvard, has published 15 books and hundreds of scientific and important empirical articles. He's also a pioneer in the study of online manipulation, and he doesn't come at this from a political point of view. He's an unbiased scientist, but he did email me the other day saying that the online environment for conservatives is rapidly getting worse through these manipulations by big tech. Between Election Day of 2024 and today, this was several days ago, 2026, liberal bias had increased 276% on Google search and by 457% on YouTube. That means they're boosting liberal content and suppressing conservative content. You had a brilliant interview with Michael Knowles. I want to go back to your brilliant piece on why you don't use Gmail, why you argue that Gmail is really a surveillance program that steals all your data. What do they do with that data when they obtain it?
Well, they sell it, and they also share it with intelligence agencies, and most importantly, they use it to build models to manipulate us more effectively. And that's the really scariest part. And if people want to learn about the dangers of using Gmail, they can go to my brand new essay that was just published. It's at thecaseagainstgmail.com, thecaseagainstgmail.com. You need to be informed about that, if nothing else. We're also expanding now our monitoring to try to make the midterms into free and fair elections. And so we're trying to expand now into those 20 battleground races. If people want to know more about that and see our monitoring system in action, which is running in all 50 states, by the way, 24 hours a day, they can go to americasdigitalshield.com. If people want to help us, there are instructions there about how they can help us. They can sponsor one of our field agents. Again, that's americasdigitalshield.com. And in general, if you want to protect yourself and your family from online surveillance and manipulation, please take a look at my website, which is myprivacytips.com. That's myprivacytips.com. And Roger, I want to thank you so much for taking an interest in what we're doing and for understanding what we're doing, because most people are completely in the dark when it comes to the surveillance and the manipulation by these big tech companies.
In the modern age, he who controls communications controls the political narrative and dialogue. And there was a period, it's still very true in many cases, where if you questioned the official narrative, whether it's about the integrity of elections or whether it's about the safety and efficiency and effectiveness of vaccinations, or whether it is about any number of Russian collusion, or whether Hunter Biden's laptop was real, whether it was Russian disinformation, you would simply be silenced and taken off the chessboard in terms of communications. Free, fair, honest elections absolutely depend on a level playing field and everybody being able to communicate in an even way. That is our goal. Strongly urge you to send a contribution to americasdigitalshield.com. They're doing vital, indeed important work that could help save the country. I'm Roger Stone. You're listening to The Roger Stone Show, and we'll be right back with more.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show, entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Roger Stone Show. Well, corrupt former FBI director and special counsel's judgment has now moved to a much higher court as Robert Mueller passes on. This is a time, I think, to review fully that Mueller was a very key player in the largest single abuse of power and political dirty trick in American history. That is the Russian collusion hoax. He knew that the legal rationale for his appointment as special counsel, where it's more and more apparent that he was essentially a frontman, by the end of his investigation, when he testified to the House in an attempt to breathe life back into the flopperoo that Mueller's findings, no Russian collusion, produced, we saw that he was virtually non-compos mentis. He had never heard of Fusion GPS, who had arranged the meetings with Don Jr. He said he was unaware of the fact that Jeannie Ray, the prosecutor in my case, had previously worked for the Clinton Foundation, despite the fact that it was at his law firm and as his law partner that she was so employed. The judge had ruled in my trial that was immaterial. By the way, it's not incidental that every single one of the prosecutors in my case under Robert Mueller was an alum of Hillary Clinton. How about that? She must not have liked my book, The Clintons' War on Women, which is still out there today, is probably the greatest single compendium of the Clintons' crimes. But this is the same Robert Mueller in the Uranium One deal. That's where Hillary Clinton secretly sold about 60% of the control of U.S.-based uranium to a Russian company, a process that required the approval of the Committee on Foreign Investment. That was ramrodded through a deal that Hillary Clinton made as Secretary of State, ramrodded through by Robert Mueller, who actually carried the sample uranium to Russia for inspection before the deal was closed. This is the same Robert Mueller who, as FBI director, got reports that there were multiple men of Middle Eastern origin living in a rented home in North Florida, training at a local flight school where they had a much greater passion for learning how to take off than they had how to land. Reports from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the county sheriff's office, as well as local police, of these men walking around at night, spooking the neighborhood. Mueller never investigated that until after the 9/11 attacks. Immediately afterwards, by the time the FBI got there, although all of the personal effects of whoever lived there who were tied to the 9/11 attackers were left intact. Their clothes, food still in the refrigerator. Whoever left in a hurry. It was also Robert Mueller who closed the investigation into the pay-for-play scheme of the Clintons. The uranium deal was just one of those ongoing deals. Essentially, Bill and Hillary Clinton ran through the Global Initiative and the Clinton Foundation an elaborate pay scheme, all arranged by and covered up by Robert Mueller. But in my particular case, it was not until Election Day. At trial, my attorneys asked the judge for the entire unredacted full report of Robert Mueller, and we were denied that. The judge said that she would read the report and she would give my defense attorneys those portions that were relevant to me. What she gave us was innocuous and irrelevant. Then BuzzFeed, no longer in business, but they sued in a freedom of information lawsuit in federal court, and they won. So a federal judge ordered the Department of Justice to release all the documents all the mentions pertaining to Roger Stone in Mueller's report. This was long hidden. So the Department of Justice elected to do this on November 3rd, 2020. That's the presidential election day, at the stroke of midnight, choosing the busiest news of the day and time to get as little press coverage as possible. They released the unredacted sections of Mueller's report, in which they admitted that despite 2 years of intense investigation, spending millions to pour through every aspect of my life, dragging 36 witnesses who I knew to the grand jury, obtaining all of my electronic communications for 4 years, which is literally millions of emails and pages of documents, tax records, banking and financial records, they found no factual evidence of any collaboration or coordination between me and WikiLeaks regarding the release of emails regarding John Podesta, the Democrat National Committee, Hillary Clinton, or all of the other claims. Even BuzzFeed, who won the release of the data in the lawsuit, actually said that I was vindicated. In other words, on page 178, that is the page the judge seems to have forgotten to turn over. In other words, the judge withheld exculpatory information from my attorneys. Exculpatory information would have proved that their entire case was built on a fraud. Recall that I'm not charged with Russian collusion, and the claim that I was in regular touch or was an intermediary between WikiLeaks and the Trump campaign, as has been widely reported by many in the mainstream media, is largely false. My lawyers and I, as we watched the mainstream media gear up for this assault on me and my family, building Mueller into some kind of honest folk hero, and claiming repeatedly that I was a Russian asset, a traitor, a spy, just based on my colorful Twitter feed and some of my speeches, little did we know that on the morning of January 19th, 2019, 29 heavily armed FBI agents, with the approval of Robert Mueller, the special counsel, stormed my home at 6 o'clock in the morning. They were brandishing fully automatic M4 assault weapons. They came by both land and sea. They came in 17 armored vehicles, and there were 2 amphibious units pulling up to the dock in the backyard where, yes, Sean Hannity loves this, frogmen, also carrying assault weapons, jumped out on the dock. All of this was captured on the home surveillance video. Now, even in this case, in this total frame job, because in order to violate the False Statements Act, I'm accused not of Russian collusion, but lying about Russian or WikiLeaks collusion that we now know definitively does not exist. It was a brilliant way to charge me when they could find, after going through millions of emails, no evidence for the crimes they accused me of. The prosecutors, not really Robert Mueller, because I think he was a near vegetable at that point, but young Andrew Weissman, one of the most vicious and corrupt former federal prosecutors in U.S. history, who was the de facto boss of the Mueller investigation, when he could find no Russian collusion or WikiLeaks collaboration on my part, after badgering witnesses and spending millions, constructed this convoluted process case in which I am accused of lying, except for now it's been proven by the declassified documents of Tulsi Gabbard that there was nothing to lie about. In other words, to violate the False Statements Act, one's statement must not only be willful, but it must be material. There is no underlying crime. The media doesn't want to tell you that part. But from the beginning, this was a witch hunt. After I was pardoned by Donald Trump, Robert Mueller, actually Andrew Weissman ghostwriting, Robert Mueller wrote a piece in the Washington Post in which he said, Roger Stone was in contact with 2 Russian intelligence assets with an S. That's false. They accused me of being in touch with Guccifer 2.0. The evidence that he is actually a Russian asset and not a CIA cutout is thin, frankly. There's more evidence that he's a creation of CIA Director Brennan. Of course, the 2 legs of the entire Mueller investigation, the so-called Steele dossier, the claim that Donald Trump, when in Moscow on private business as a private citizen, had dallied in a Paris hotel room with beautiful French prostitutes, and he had been entertained by watching them urinate on a bed once occupied by the Obamas, is a complete and total fiction paid for by Hillary Clinton's campaign. Andrew Weissman knew that all the way back to the time that he was the general counsel at the FBI under, yes, you guessed it, Robert Mueller. So they knew that leg of the stool was a fraud, yet they used it as the principal rationale for the granting of the FISA warrants that allowed them to spy on Donald Trump's campaign. When I say that, I'm, of course, referring to Robert Mueller and his sidekick, Andrew Weissman. At the end of the day, of course, their investigation turned up no actual Russian collusion, so they tried very, very quickly to shift the focus to obstruction of justice. That also failed in an incredible attempt to reinflate their narrative. When their final report came up with no Russian collusion, they sent Robert Mueller up to testify on Capitol Hill, and it was an unmitigated disaster, I think, proving the point that Mueller himself was never actually in charge. So I am grateful to God Almighty and to Donald Trump for recognizing that I didn't do anything wrong. There is no Russian collusion to lie about. I was charged and subjected to a Soviet-style show trial with a deeply biased and hateful judge who attacked me repeatedly from the bench, as well as anyone who defended me, who put me under an unconstitutional gag order, also sought to unconstitutionally gag the members of my family so that they could not speak in my defense. Yet when BuzzFeed won their lawsuit and vindication came, we finally got the Robert Mueller's final report, which they hid from me, which they admitted that I had not been involved in Russian collusion, any coordination with WikiLeaks, or any other crime. In fact, on page 178 of Mueller's report, he actually says that he found no evidence of coordination or even extensive communications with WikiLeaks, but even if he had, he concluded that it would have been consistent with my First Amendment rights. So Robert Mueller's reputation, I think the media tries to prop him up. He was indeed, I think, a front man all along. Amazing piece by Amanda Devine last week in the New York Post about the raw and naked partisanship of the Mueller investigation, because those who authorized this and ran it knew from the beginning it was a fraud. I believe it is one continuing seditious conspiracy born in April of 2016 in an Oval Office meeting chaired by Barack Obama himself. James Comey was there, the FBI director. A little more about him later. CIA Director John Brennan was there. The meeting was chaired by Barack Obama, of course, but Vice President Joe Biden was there. Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, was there. Dr. James Clapper, General James Clapper, I should say, then the Director of OGNI was there. And this is where the Clinton plan, as it was referred to, laid out. Robert Mueller sullied his reputation. They're going to try to point to his military service. He was, I believe, a Marine Corps veteran with a Bronze Star. But he also became the cleanup man for the deep state. And he let the young leftists under him, who really used him as the kind of imprimatur of federal authority based on a past due a reputation, destroy lives. Like I say, the judgment for Mr. Mueller is going to a much, much higher court, and I pray for the repose of his soul, because his sins against me and my family are many. We'll be right back.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
So, Robert Mueller, the Russiagate special counsel, the man who approved the 6 a.m. raid on my home, in which CNN just conveniently happened to be, totally out of coincidence, and gut investigator reporting, I have a full camera crew 25 feet from my front door to capture my public humiliation, has passed away. It is not coincidental that CNN was there. I was arrested, handcuffed, and perp walked through the front yard. Then my wife was put through the same exact ritual, made to stand in the freezing street about 25 feet apart, me handcuffed. When it became absolutely clear this was a made-for-television moment. I later got an affidavit from a Fort Lauderdale police officer who is now retired, but who had been carried in to back up the FBI that day, who said that when he told the CNN crew that they would have to move down the block behind a rope where the rest of the media was being contained, he was chewed out by an FBI agent who told him that CNN had a special permission to be 25 feet from the front door so that they could broadcast this public humiliation. They knew that even though I'm a supporter of the Second Amendment, I had no firearm in the house. They knew that I didn't have a valid passport, and thanks to their ongoing and Chinese water-like attacks on me in the previous weeks, and the constant leaking from the Mueller investigation, I'm universally identifiable and therefore not a flight risk. They claimed that I had to be taken down in this incredible way with all of that hardware, and a raid that the FBI finally was forced to admit cost $1.1 million because they claimed I was a flight risk. Yet, when they took me to the local federal courthouse after first going to the FBI booking center in Miramar, about an hour drive at 7 o'clock in the morning, to be fingerprinted and mugshotted, and then returned to a federal courthouse to be arraigned, wearing shackles and handcuffs, standing in a courtroom in front of 300 jeering left-wing reporters to enter a not a guilty plea. That is all the work of Robert Mueller for what we now know was a total frame job. There was no Russian collusion to lie about it. Mueller himself actually concluded that. So Andrew Weissman constructed this extraordinarily clever obstruction case when, in fact, there was extraordinary obstruction. The case was cooked from the beginning when the judge agreed with a ruling that the government didn't have to prove Russian collusion in order to convict me, and they would not allow me to introduce either expert testimony or forensic evidence in which I could absolutely have proven there was no online hack of the DNC, which of course is the underlying act that my indictment was based on. The other canard that they who try to defend Mueller come up with is that Paul Manafort, Donald Trump's campaign manager, was passing valuable polling information on to a Russian intelligence asset, a man named Konstantin Kalimnik. Andrew Weissman and Robert Mueller and many others who tried to prop up the failed and empty-handed Mueller investigation continue to bring this up. There's only one minor problem. As the independent journalist Matt Taibbi particularly has proved, Konstantin Kalimnik was not only not a Russian agent, he's actually a U.S. asset. In fact, Kalimnik was so important in the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, they had a code name to protect him in the cable traffic between Ukraine and Washington. So $30 million, completely unfettered legal authority, go into every aspect of your life, your bank accounts, your tax records, to surveil you, to wiretap you. In my case, prosecutor Aaron Zarinsky tried to convince a young guy to entrap me wearing a wire during the Mueller investigation, because he was a man of honor, young field man who I'd met in the Trump campaign, an up-and-comer in politics. Because they threatened to prosecute him. Thank God they did not. By the way, he knew nothing, and there's nothing that I could have told him. There was no Russian collusion to hide. That is the enduring legacy of Robert Mueller, a man involved in the greatest single scandal and abuse of power in my lifetime. History will not be kind to him. And I think we owe more to Tulsi Gabbard than anyone else, as well as Donald Trump. He gave the order for the full declassification of all the documents that proved there was a deep state plot to take down Donald Trump, and Robert Mueller was in the middle of it.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. Roger Stone Show. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Joel Gilbert is a real mensch. He's also a very influential film and documentary producer and investigative reporter with a long record of affecting the public dialogue. He did some incisive reporting for the Gateway Pundit that pointed out that Congressman Eric Swalwell, now a would-be candidate for governor of California, doesn't actually have a California legal residence and is thus not eligible to be a candidate for governor, and that he has quite a mansion, however, in Washington, D.C., and he's got a host of other problems. So we kind of began just pulling on a thread the narrow question of the eligibility of Eric Swalwell. He is kind of the Pancho Villa to Adam Schiff, his right-wing goon, a man who first came to real national prominence when it was revealed that he was having, as a member of the House Intelligence Committee, he was having an affair with a female Chinese intelligence asset, a spy, a Matahari, if you will. Let's just say that he penetrated her and she penetrated his office with a number of employees at a time that he had full access to classified information as a member of the House Committee. So the guy who accused me for 2 years of being a Russian intelligence asset is a cheerleader for Robert Mueller's Fugazi crusade to destroy Donald Trump and me in the crossfire. He is now, I think, on the ropes. This story's come a long way, Joel. Kind of take us from the beginning when you discovered the circumstances of Congressman Eric Swalwell's residence.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Well, I was looking into mortgages of Democrats mostly in Washington, D.C., other places in the country. It started with Letitia James way back. And looking at Eric Swalwell's mortgage in Washington, D.C., I noticed that he declared in sworn documents that this would be his principal residence to his bank and his deed of trust, thereby getting the lowest possible interest rate. And once I came out with that story, he got referred to the Department of Justice by Bill Pulte because of the conflict that he's supposed to have a principal residence in California. So that got me looking at him in California. When he declares for governor only weeks later, he puts in a statement on his candidate statement to the Secretary of State of California, giving his home address as his lawyer's office in Sacramento. So I thought, I'm not surprised that he doesn't have an address in California because of his financial issues that I also discovered. When he first ran for Congress in 2012, Swalwell had $100,000 in student debt and also owed $100,000 on credit cards. Sure enough, 12 years later, in his last congressional statement in 2024, he hadn't paid down any of his student debts or his credit cards. So something's wrong with this guy financially. Like, where's all his money going? His wife supposedly works full-time. He's making $174,000 a year. So when I saw that he didn't have a California address, it wasn't surprising. It fit this idea that this guy's a financial mess. So I decided, after doing some research and finding out he never owned any property in Alameda County, had no rental, I decided to file something called a petition for writ of mandate to demand that the California courts instruct the Secretary of State of California not to certify Swalwell on March 26 when they certify candidates.
And you are, of course, a California state resident.
Correct.
So you have standing.
Correct. As a voter, I have standing. So I filed this, and it's actually coming up tomorrow at 9 a.m. is going to be the case. Now, on Friday, the judge actually issued a ruling, like a preliminary ruling, that didn't really favor me, but I still have a chance to argue in court tomorrow. If I don't win, I will absolutely appeal. But what Swalwell did is, all this time, if he really had an address in California, he could have just posted it on Twitter and said, here's my lease, here's my home, nothing. So last week, the sister-in-law of a campaign worker submitted a statement to the court, and she said, I rented my property to Swalwell and his wife in 2017. She doesn't supply any lease, no terms, no checks, nothing, just a statement. New York Post sends their reporter out there, and they see there's a German Shepherd in the backyard. It's a 1,300-square-foot house where she lives with her husband and her son, and they talk to the neighbors. They never saw Swalwell. Tom Steyer's campaign gets into it. They actually put out a statement. They looked at Swalwell's congressional expense records and saw that every time he went to his district, he stayed in a fancy hotel, the Rose Hotel. I then looked at the tax records of Alameda County with this address in Livermore. It turns out this woman took a homestead exemption every single year for $7,000. It's a tax credit. And to get that, you're required to live in the home. So I gave all that to the court. So where it stands now is tomorrow I'm going to simply argue to the judge, we've got actual government documents. Swalwell filled out his candidate statement and said, I live at my lawyer's office. We got this woman saying that she rented to him, but I've got evidence that she lives there and not Swalwell. So I think I have a chance to win. If not, I'm going to appeal it. But Swalwell absolutely does not have standing. He doesn't live in California. The California Constitution requires you to live in California for 5 years prior to an election. So I think he's ineligible. I think he's a total mess, and I think this is going to catch up to him. Now, in addition, you might have seen I put out on Twitter and on Gateway Pundit yesterday, in looking into all of Swalwell's background, I found evidence that he was employing an illegal alien Brazilian nanny for 2 years, violating likely immigration laws, tax laws, labor laws, and actually put in a complaint to the Department of Justice. It's on my Twitter. You can read all about it. I've got all the evidence very well documented. Swalwell seems to have a problem with immigration law. You know, he doesn't want to fund DHS. He doesn't want ICE in California. He certainly doesn't want them raiding his house because I think they would find an illegal worker there. I also put in an FEC complaint because it turns out that Swalwell has been charging full-time child care for 5 years to his donors, to his campaign, $300,000 worth of child care payments. In fact, the FEC says you can only charge campaign-related event child care, and you have to document it and say, I went to Pittsburgh at 4 o'clock and I came back on Saturday, so I paid my child care worker for this one day. What Swalwell does on his disclosures, he pays full-time, year-round, 52 weeks a year, charges child care to his campaign, to his donors. So imagine what a sucker you are if you gave Swalwell money for his campaign and he's using it to subsidize his personal child care. So I actually got a call from the Federal Election Commission. They called me to say, hey, we got your complaint. We want to know, we're going to assign this to an investigator. I said, great. How does it work? They said, well, it's going to take a couple of months, but you won't hear anything until we publish our findings. And I said, great, because I gave him all the evidence. So, look, Swalwell is, I think he's reeling right now. He calls me names on Twitter. He says it's all a MAGA conspiracy. He just had to drop his lawsuit against Bill Pulte, where he tried to sue him for referring him to the Department of Justice, claiming that his mortgage that's been online for 5 years is somehow private. So I think it's a battle worth doing because Swalwell is a disaster. He's a former attorney, district attorney. He's never done anything in his life. And if he can't manage his own finances, how does he manage a $500 billion budget of the state of California? So there's a lot to come on this, and tomorrow I'll be updating everyone on Twitter because I have a 9 a.m. court hearing with Judge Chang. Swalwell's going to be there, and the Secretary of State's going to be there.
This is an extraordinary toss and turn for Eric Swalwell. It is absolutely clear also that the Biden administration, the Inspector General of the U.S. Justice Department in the Biden administration, found that Congressman Adam Schiff and Congressman Eric Swalwell had illegally leaked classified information to various media outlets to reflect negatively on President Trump. Of course, they have not been prosecuted for that. Just like James Comey saying under oath that he's never shared protected, sealed, or classified information with any third party and directed them to leak it to anyone, when there's email that exists to show him doing exactly that with a man named Daniel Richman. When he got charged, a bank of left-wing judges did away with the case, not by weighing the facts or the evidence, but by disqualifying the prosecutor appointed by Donald Trump, Lindsay Halligan, a ruling that I believe will be overturned. Eric Swalwell was a full-throated cheerleader for the Russian collusion hoax, but at least in those days he used to wear a tie. For some reason, stylistically, he seems to have gone the way of Steve Bannon. He appears unshaven, sometimes even unbathed. He looks like a man who's literally falling apart.
Yeah, look, I'll agree with you on that. If you listen to his Twitter posts, even when he gives speeches in Congress, he constantly uses the F word in public, F word, S word. Every day he's using these foul language. He doesn't shave anymore. He wants to look like one of the homeless people in his district. His strategy is he thinks if I look like a jerk and act like a jerk and I'm a big anti-Trump radical, maybe I'll get 10 or 12% of the vote in the Democrat primary that'll get me into the final runoff. And because it's a Democrat state, maybe that's my path to get elected. And the reason I filed this, Roger, is because you mentioned those other cases with Adam Schiff, we saw with Letitia James. Kind of nothing happens. So I said, you know what, I can do this myself. And I wrote a lawsuit pro se. It's been very good. I've done well with it. I've had an attorney accuse me jokingly of practicing law without a license. But I am out there. I've got the case. It's coming up tomorrow. And I will appeal if I have to. And Swalwell kind of made a mistake. I went to his town hall, believe it or not, in Santa Monica back in January. And he came around and shook everybody's hand. It was supposed to be a 2-hour town hall. And he came up and shook my hand and said hello. And I think he recognized me right away. And I was going to ask him, what is your address in California? So after about 20 minutes of this 2-hour town hall, he cuts it off. And it's over. I think he recognized me and didn't want to expose himself to being asked the question, Eric, where do you live? He does not have an address in California. He's not eligible. And the courts are going to look at it tomorrow. If they don't agree with me, I will be appealing. I think I'll have a great appeal.
Why do you believe this? Wasn't this initially a decision by the Secretary of State? 22 seconds, kind of unfair, but why do you think he did not uphold the law?
He has he thinks he's above the law. It happens. A lot of these California and New York Democrat politicians just are never really held to account, so they don't bother following the law. They think they can get by. That's what Swalwell's counting on.
All right. Joel Gilbert, you're listening to the Stone Zone, and we'll be right back.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show, entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
We're talking to Joel Gilbert, investigative journalist, writes often for the Gateway Pundit, also a maker of a number of noted documentaries. It's a very interesting. Recently, you told me about the case of a man named Daniel Jones. Information that you located, kind of an alternative theory of who was promoting the Russian collusion hoax. I think we now know, at least at a minimum, based on the declassified documents, that players like Norm Eisen, Andrew Weissman, Robert Mueller, Rod Rothstein, and of course those in the original room, Obama, Biden, McCabe, the FBI director, Brennan, key ringleader, the CIA director, and of course the general over at OGNI, and then lastly Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor. But tell us about Daniel Jones and what's compellingly interesting about this case.
Yeah, I did do some new original research on the Russia hoax, and I studied this character named Daniel Jones. He was in the FBI for 8 years. He then worked for Dianne Feinstein on the Senate Intelligence Committee. And I identified that I believe that he was the center of the entire Russia hoax narrative, and it represented a much wider conspiracy. People remember that Daniel Jones and Christopher Steele and Fusion GPS were paid $1 million by Perkins Coie, the Democrat Party attorneys. But it turns out, I believe that was a smokescreen for a wider conspiracy and a much better funded conspiracy. Daniel Jones, it turns out, founded two investigative organizations, one called the Penn Quarter Group, another called the Democracy Integrity Project, and he got a total of $63 million for these two organizations. He pays Fusion GPS and Christopher Steele $7.5 million, about 7 times more than the Democrats paid him. He also founded this organization which disseminated the Russia hoax for years after it happened to the media, to politicians, to intelligence. He was ground zero, the center of the whole thing. He founded these organizations in April of 2016. It was the very same month that Fusion GPS was hired to create the Russia collusion hoax. So I think he was at the center of it. He was a much bigger conspirator, and I'm currently searching to find out where did he get his $63 million from, because the amount of money he had to work with and the amount of money he paid these characters pales in comparison to what the Democrats did. So I think it was a wider conspiracy with other actors that funded this guy, and I'm hoping my research will help the whole thing who really did it come to light.
Yeah, based on my own research, it appears a lot that these quote-unquote researchers who produced the Steele dossier at Fusion GPS essentially resold the same product three times. First, I think to Paul Singer, the owner of the Free Beacon and unabashed neocon, I think who may have purchased it for the benefit of Marco Rubio's presidential campaign, although there's no evidence that it was usefully used. Then, of course, selling it to Hillary Clinton in that disguise transaction, hiding it as legal fees for which Hillary Clinton's campaign pays a massive fine. Of course, Donald Trump did that. They tried to put him in jail.
Right.
And then lastly, of course, getting it picked up at yahoo.com is the old trick of plant a story and then point to a judge and say, here, judge, it's in the newspaper, it's at yahoo.com, therefore it must be true. Oldest trick in the book, but that's very much how the early stages of the Russian collusion hoax begins. It is a unique cabal between the Democrats and the legacy mass media to lionize Robert Mueller, a man who was a traitor and who violated both the Constitution and the law in his efforts to try to remove a duly elected president and destroy me and General Michael Flynn and countless others at the same time. I'm confident that will be his legacy. Joel Gilbert, tell folks where they can find you on X.
Yeah, Joel S. Gilbert. Joel S. Gilbert. Check the results of the case tomorrow. Thank you, Roger.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And we're back in the Stone Zone. Anytime you're listening to the Roger Stone Zone, you got to be in the zone. And we're in the zone today. Rod Martin now is our next guest. Now, are we ready for Rod? Rod is one of my favorite thinkers. And he's going to be joining us to talk about the Straits of Hormuz. If Donald Trump posting this right now, and that is the question of the Straits of Hormuz, he says, if Iran is not fully open without threat, the Straits of Hormuz would 48 hours from this exact point in time, the U.S. will hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest of the first. Thank you for your attention to this matter. That was Theodore Rooseveltian. Rod Martin, who publishes a lively Substack and also publishes the Rod Martin Report. You can find him at rodmartin.org. One of my favorite entrepreneurs, thinkers, businessmen, capitalists, but a shrewd geopolitical thinker as well, joins us now.
It is great to be here.
Rod, you had a terrific piece here in which you took kind of a different look at the whole question of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the brutal Islamic regime has said from the beginning if we attacked them that they would move to close down the strait through which much of the world's oil passes. Donald Trump kind of humiliated our many NATO allies, saying, well, we have to keep this open, who's with us? And, of course, they got a resounding silence from all of our NATO allies. But you took a different view here. Walk us through your view as to why Trump may, in fact, be in no hurry to reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, he's really not, because, there are military considerations, but there are also geopolitical considerations that extend far beyond Iran. So it's absolutely true. 20% of the world's oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. That's a big deal. Some of that can be diverted. Even Iran is seeking to divert some of it to its much smaller port with a too small pipeline that's on the Gulf of Oman. So that actually bypasses the strait. And we're going to pretty much interdict that. But Saudi Arabia can transfer between 5 and 7 million barrels a day to the Red Sea through its east-west pipeline and away from the port at Ras Tanura. So, and then what Scott Bessent announced yesterday about using the Iranian oil that's already in tankers on the oceans to alleviate supply problems, temporarily desanction Russian oil, 400 million barrels released from various strategic petroleum reserves. All of these things contribute to a short-term price mitigation compared to what would happen. So what does that allow the president to do? Well, first and foremost, it chokes off Iran's ability to pay for a continued war. And you see that playing out every single day. We are down to a tiny fraction of the number of missile launches that we had been seeing at the very outset of the war. And it's not just that we're taking out the missiles. It's not just that they're blowing up the missiles that they're able to get through. It's that we've destroyed the plants in which they build them. So every missile they fire is one less that they will ever have. And that's a really, really big deal. So we are finishing the job in Iran. And second, for the last week, we have been doing a tremendous job in conjunction with the Israelis of using drone strikes to target individual members of the IRGC who are doing crowd control. You know, if you come out in the streets and protest, they want to shoot you dead. And it's a little hard to do that if a drone has already killed you. So we are getting to the point where there can be a critical mass where the people can rise up and take back their country. But the third thing is about our allies. You will notice the allies did not step up to protect their oil supplies. The oil from the Persian Gulf that flows to friends of the United States is significant, whether you're talking about Japan or Korea or Taiwan or Australia or NATO. Almost none of it comes to the United States, and 100% of it that does come to the United States is replaceable. This is not 1973. So the president invites them to participate. They demur. Okay, we don't need them. So we go and prove that we don't need them in this magnificent campaign we've been conducting for the last 3 weeks. And then the president says, hey, we want to keep the straits open for your oil to flow. Just send some frigates and some minesweepers. We don't want you in combat. We're not asking you to put yourself in harm's way. We're just asking you to escort some tankers and do some minesweeping with us. And they still say no. Now, they will not even protect their own oil. So what Donald Trump has done here is he has demonstrated just exactly how weak NATO is. He said a few weeks ago, America will be there for Europe. I don't know if Europe will be there for us. He just proved that Europe won't even be there for Europe. Finally, the crisis in the Strait has provided an opportunity to decouple from Lloyd's of London and the other maritime insurers in the City of London. And this is a hammer that you can tell by the lead up to this. Donald Trump and Scott Bessent have been planning for a year. They have set us up with the U.S. Development Finance Corporation to be able to intervene and basically take away the last remnant of British imperial power, which is their almost complete control of maritime shipping through maritime insurance. That is a huge wealth transfer from the City of London to the United States, and if Starmer doesn't want it to happen, he better get with the program, or Donald Trump will close the trap.
It's very, very hard to recognize modern-day Britain. The so-called special relationship is nothing special about it. There are fundamental foundational documents regarding liberty and freedom, and important matters such as free speech are based on theirs, the Magna Carta, but free speech is dead in the UK, where children literally can be arrested if they post something online that the regime disagrees with, and one is not allowed to criticize radical Islam in any way, shape, or form. Most people would not believe that. They do not step up in the Strait of Hormuz. They even restrict U.S. access to our own base, Diego Garcia. Starmer is really just extraordinarily weak. The Germans are not much better. They all talk, but very little real support from our so-called partners.
Well, I saw something recently that suggested that Keir Starmer's socialist government in Britain has actually arrested 10 times as many people as Putin's Russia has for free speech issues, 10 times as many in Britain, and that's in just a very short amount of time. It flummoxes me. I did a fellowship at Cambridge. I lived over there for the better part of 2 years. Absolutely loved it. I was the political officer for the Cambridge University Conservative Association, so we were organizing students to go help in parliamentary by-elections all over the island right at the end of Mrs. Thatcher's time. I love England, and to see what has become of it just breaks my heart.
Yeah, no, I've spoken at the prestigious Oxford Political Union, and that was a great opportunity. I also spoke at a number of other political unions there, and of course my tailor, no longer on Savile Row, but certainly Savile Row style, Anderson and Shepard, who made suits for Fred Astaire and the Duke of Windsor, Gary Cooper, and Jack Buchanan and others. And of course, C.J. Cleverly, I think the best custom shoemaker in the country. That old England, I fear, is gone, where you literally have a horrific problem with hordes of illegal, or perhaps, I guess in this case, legal immigrants assaulting women, creating crime throughout the country. Yet, if you criticize them or if you resist them, you will be the one who's arrested, not them.
Yes, exactly that. And it's just absolutely a repudiation of the entire history of English common law, of English rights. You know, the American Revolution, more than anything else, was an assertion by the English people of this continent of their rights obtained 100 years earlier in the English Bill of Rights. And we have seen England evolve in the direction of freedom for most of the time since. Obviously, they didn't treat us that well at the end of the 18th century, but that got better too. And now we're seeing it all disappear. It's almost as though they've elected Henry VIII, and we're back to the Star Chamber. And it's just a horrifying thing. They must have a general election. They must get rid of this ridiculous, evil socialist regime. These guys got in on about 32% of the vote because the Tories truly betrayed their mandate and ended up abandoned at the ballot box, and Starmer wins by default. But there's a real opportunity, I think, for change. I'm very encouraged by what I see with Nigel Farage's Reform UK. I see other things stirring over there that are really positive. I think there's hope if they can just last long enough.
Yeah, I think it is important to recognize that in both Canada and the UK, the old Tory party, the Conservative Party, is not at all conservative. It is largely a globalist and a neocon party that is identical to Labour in its policies. That is true in both countries. The action is in the independent nationalist party of Farage and others, and that is most definitely an issue. But it is extraordinary to see kind of the cradle of democracy and free speech be destroyed. So Tommy Robinson, independent journalist who's faced jail numerous times because he's had the courage to criticize radical Islam in his home country, interviewed me recently, and the situation there is sad. I turned down an opportunity to return to the Oxford Union for security reasons. It is a political correct society where I could most certainly not count on the protection of the local or the federal police if I chose to speak. So unfortunately, even though I probably owe my tailor money, I won't be seeing him this month or any time soon. So you take the view, Rod, that these short-term increase in energy prices, you think this will be a temporary aberration? And do you think things will return in time to positively affect the 2026 election?
I do. I think, first of all, this war is going to be quite short. And, to hear some of the media people go on about how it's a quagmire and a forever war is just absurd. It's been going on for 3 weeks. I mean, what do you want, guys? This is ridiculous. But I think it ends pretty quickly. I think it ends in a bang, not a whimper. I think the regime ultimately does fall. I think there's an opening for a free Iran, which in 15 to 20 years' time max would be a first world country. It's just incredibly rich in resources and in educated entrepreneurial people who can make it a showplace for the entire region, a beacon of hope for everybody over there. I really believe that can happen. But whether it does or whether it doesn't, an Iran that is, an Iranian regime that is defeated means that we really have a chance going forward, one way or another, to bring Iranian oil and gas production back online in a serious, unsanctioned way. That will do wonders for the price of oil. The other piece of that is that we have been paying a risk premium for oil from the Persian Gulf virtually my whole lifetime. Ever since 79, there's been a risk premium built into the price that everybody's kind of lost track of, based on the decent chance that Iran could at any time mine the Strait of Hormuz. Well, that's going to go away. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you see another $10 or $15 a barrel drop just based on that. Now you're talking about $50 oil. And, the frackers will have to adjust a little bit in the Permian and the Bakken, but they're going to survive and thrive. And what we just showed in this conflict is that if you're not importing your oil and gas from America, your supply is vulnerable. And Donald Trump is going to lock in a bunch more energy deals.
He gets a total of $50,000, 20 and 30. Pardon me. I apologize. I was writing a note here to my wife. So I agree with you. I think Trump is playing this extraordinarily well. We are talking, of course, to Rod Martin. You can find him at rodmartin.org, and we'll be right back with more of Rod Martin.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show, entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
We're back with my good friend Rod Martin. He is an entrepreneur, a thinker. Blaze TV once deemed him one of America's leading public intellectuals. He is a solid conservative investor, businessman, had great success in internet, biotech, aerosphere, and energy. But he also sees things from, as I do, as a political animal. He once worked for Governor Mike Huckabee and worked for one of the greatest members of Congress, J.P. Hammerschmidt, longtime Republican member from Arkansas. Rod, you've written and spoken quite a bit about how Donald Trump is more like Ronald Reagan than he is like George Bush. Tell us about that.
Well, he's very little like George Bush and tremendously like Reagan. And it's quite extraordinary because based on his communication style, you wouldn't get that. They seem like very different people. But Ronald Reagan understood that the best use of American power was short, sharp bursts, and then arming and supporting allies to do their own lifting in their different theaters. So we didn't invade Nicaragua. We supported the Contras. We didn't invade Angola. We supported UNITA. And we took the battle to the enemy in a way that collapsed their ability to focus on us. At the same time, we deprived them of the hard currency necessary to keep up in an arms race that Reagan initiated and carried out with zeal and delight. And Donald Trump is doing this exact same thing to China. China is increasingly boxed in. It is being shorn of its allies. It is losing its steeply discounted sanctioned oil that's helping prop up its teetering economy. And increasingly, it just has nowhere to go. So my guess is what we'll see is Trump working out a trade deal with them that they really can't refuse, and it boxes them in a key way where it just costs too much to go to war. And as a result of that, the regime is going to face the same problem the Soviet regime did. It will collapse in time of its own weight. That's exactly what happened in Russia. That's what's going to happen in China, and the architect is Donald Trump.
The use of oil here strategically, cutting off the oil for Cuba, for example. Although I know Mexico rushing to the short-term rescue, denying the Chinese oil, which puts them in no position to move on Taiwan. This is peace through strength. This is the projected, limited, yet extraordinary lethal use of American power, but it's also the combination of military power, economic pressure and power, and of course, political pressure. Trump really is a master at this. It is a return to the peace through strength policies of Dwight Eisenhower and I think Ronald Reagan, rather than the foreign adventurism, regime change oriented new world order policy of the Bushes, and sadly the Democrats who preceded him and succeeded them. I want to thank our guest, Rod Martin. Go to rodmartin.org or go to the Martin Report on Substack if you want to be ahead of the curve. He is a brilliant analyst of the body politic, American business, and particularly strong on foreign policy trends. Strongly recommend that you catch up with him and subscribe. I find it must reading every single day. Rod, thanks for joining us so much today in the Stone Zone right here on The Roger Stone Show.
Thanks for listening to The Roger Stone Show. You can hear The Roger Stone Show Sunday afternoons at 3. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode so you never have to wonder.
What the heck is going on here?